Hello and welcome back to another Plex Media Server test video, but with a slight difference. Today we are utilising a QNAP, which we've done before. In this case it is the TS-h973AX. It's also an AMD Ryzen embedded test. This is utilising the AMD Ryzen that we have utilised in other Plex tests before, but this is the first time we've run a Plex test using a QNAP with this processor. Even though they were the first to the market, we have tested this processor in other NASes. On top of that, this is their most affordable ZFS file system NAS. That's right, this is a system that utilizes QuTS Hero, and it's the most affordable ZFS NAS in their lineup. So this is a ZFS NAS that takes advantage of inline deduplication and inline compression. Two things that we're not really going to see the benefits of in today's video. On top of that, there are improved caching. In fact, this system does have some SSDs in the background being used for caching the main storage of data. We've got 3 traditional hard drives inside. They're quite enterprise grade hard drives though, I should add, so you may hear the NAS behind me a couple of meters away clinking and clonking around in there, but there's also SSD caching happening in the background as well. A lot of this largely benefiting directly into the NAS system itself. You can see how much of the cache storage is benefiting Plex here in the Plex data, but as you can see, this is more about the running of Plex than the multimedia. The reason I'm volunteering all of this is simply that I don't believe these are going to make a huge amount of impact on the system while it is operational for Plex Media Server, because these are large chunky media files that SSD caching rarely benefits in the grand scheme of things, particularly in transcoding, which is far less of a frequent action that caching will benefit. But the reason I'm leaving it on is this NAS is preparing for some other videos coming very, very soon. But these are all things that you can add to it, whether you want to utilize caching or not. And I am using a 16 gig model, but that 16 gig is so I can take advantage in other videos of decompression and deduplication in the background. These things you have to have at least 16 gig of memory to really take advantage of. But as you will see throughout this video, that won't make a big difference at all for Plex. As long as you've got a good chunk of memory, you know, at least 2 to 4 gigs spare, all of the files for today's video will run fine. I'm going to change the parameters for 5-minute windows on this memory schedule, so we'll be able to compare files as they go through it. And bear in mind that ZFS is quite a hungry beast, and that's why we've got more than 5 gig being utilized, because ZFS compared with ext4 uses more memory typically. But that is the setup we're running today. Let's have a look at the Plex Media Server. As we see, there's the UI of our Plex. You can look at here at the top. The IP for both of them is definitely this system. On top of that, I have given Plex the ability to transcode and make my CPU hurt, and it is a PlexPass account. And of course, the CPU is not one that features embedded graphics. This isn't a CPU that's going to have any kind of transcoding engine or any kind of assisted graphical support like you would find in an Intel Core or a Celeron. So you are going to see spiking CPU utilization throughout this test. So let's get things started straight away. As always, we're going to start with the Matrix, the 1999 movie. This is an H.264 720p file at 1.5 megabits per second. It's a very light file, but it's atypical of the majority of 720p movies out there. And at the background, we've got this all running. We've had to mute this, of course, before the YouTube bots take this video down. And we can just go ahead and skip throughout the video. And even though we're watching a movie over the network, it's absolutely fine. In fact, if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, utilization is pretty non-existent there as we skip through the film non-stop. Now, while it's doing that, let's start looking into some transcoding. It was originally playing back in original format, so now let's bring it down to 480, and this is where we're going to see the first spike. I say that, it was instantaneous. There was like that tiny moment hesitation there. I don't know if you saw that or caught that during the change of it, between flicking between 720p and 480p. So now let's go down even further to 240p. The system needs a little bit more time. We saw a spike there, and again, One of the main reasons you might look at transcoding is if you're using a metered data connection or using a device such as a mobile that doesn't need these enormous files. It's worth highlighting again, and this will become even more relevant later in the test when you see just how big some of these files are. So for example, the file that we're playing right now is relatively modest, but later on when we look at the larger files, these are all what you're seeing on the left here, 30 seconds long. But some of them are as heavy as 1.4 gigabytes for 30 seconds of footage. This is the kind of file that I do not expect this NAS to play, but we shall see. And as you can see, the file sizes get smaller as the format gets less aggressive. So that will become far more abundantly clear later. Before we finish up with Plex, let's knock it down to a 160p test. And there was a little bit of a delay there, but overall we can see the tiny spike, but it has managed to do the job. And again, I'm sure a number of you are taking a little look at some of these parameters here to see what exactly the memory utilization is doing. We can see the blue line being availability, and we can have a look at where the ARC inline stuff with ZFS has its mark and utilization on the memory, but ultimately it doesn't seem to be making a lot of help either one way or the other. The real utilization, of course, is the used. That's the one that we want to focus on. So we'll keep on availability. No, we'll just get rid of availability and just look at the usage. So let's come out of the matrix. And now we're going to go into our second file. It's the 1080p file for Little Shop of Horrors. I know you've seen me test these same files time and time and again, guys, but we need a sense of uniformity. We can't just change all the files around. So this is a 1080p file here, H.264 again. And again, we can flick all the way along. It's going to run absolutely fine over the network. Oh, paused it by accident. As you see, the file's working absolutely fine. Now we're going to go into some transcoding, and again this time we're going to knock it down to 480. Now this is where we normally start to see a bit of bother. Moving between 1080p and 480p at this file size seems to cause the odd bit of lag. This has happened across the format. It's been less of a problem with NASs that have featured embedded graphics and a transcoding engine for obvious reasons, but have a look at that CPU utilization right there. We've seen a definite spike there as the system has had to deal with this slightly more troubling task. It will play, and as you have a look, the buffering is absolutely fine, but there's no avoiding that it's not the easiest task. And as mentioned, if we go down all the way to 160p, the system will be able to do it. It's just not going to be able to do it with the alacrity that we've seen so far. And don't worry about the pixelization. That is exactly what you would expect from a file that's been converted to this teeny tiny size. And CPU utilization, as you can see there, has spiked quite dramatically there in the background. So let's move away from these more understandable files and go straight into the test. So straight again, we have got the Jellyfish test files. I recommend you check them out. And we have got H.264, which is absolutely fine. And we have HEVC, which isn't. HEVC, otherwise known as H.265, is a file format and compression method that has gained a lot of traction. However, there are licensing issues with a number of NAS and indeed third-party software and playback devices throughout the world in hardware to support it. And a number of vendors just do not include that ability, forcing you to transcode immediately. The same goes for 10-bit versions with the same problem. So H.264 files should play with relative ease. As we see there, one click straight away on this file, it is playing it back fine. And of course, if we go into the transcoding, that's when we're going to see slight problems. So we go down to a 480p. Bear in mind, again, this is the smallest of these files at a mere 10 megabytes in size. It's when we get to some of the bigger ones in a few minutes where we're going to start to see those problems arise. So let's come out of it there. And once again, this time we're going to do the H.265 or HEVC version. And if we open up, we can see that it's immediately gone into a conversion. It's had to transcode that file because of the limitations of not being able to play H.265 with such relative ease. So if we flick down into the settings here, and again go down to 480p on this file, we'll be able to scale this file down. And again, there's a slight delay. We can have a look at the buffering at the bottom of the screen, but we seem to have been absolutely fine there with that conversion, and playback has not outpaced the buffering. Finally, while we're at this tier, let's have a look at the 1080p 10-bit HEVC file. So again, going straight into a conversion. We'll leave that there. The buffering's taking place. CPU utilization on all of those tests has been higher with each tier, as you see there on screen. That first pink bump there representing the conversion of H.264 to a 480p file, and the other two are the higher versions. If we bring it down, and again we're going to go even lower, we're going to go to 160p. So this is where we might see that CPU hitting a few walls, but it has seemingly transcoded that file and the CPU has done the job. So, as explained, H.264 will seemingly always play back a great deal easier. So if we go for the larger file type, so 30 meg H.264, this should in theory play back. And as we see, the buffering wasn't instantaneous, but it certainly played, and the buffering wildly outpaced that of playback. Let's go even higher. Let's go now towards 100 megabyte H.264, megabits per second I should say, and boom, playback, although caching is only just outpacing that of playback. So again, we're seeing a little bit of struggle there, and I would expect that at this higher tier of 1080p on our catalogue of Jellyfish files. Remember, the URL is always on screen there for you guys. So we've got the playback there. Now, this is where we move into 4K for H.264. This is 120 megabits per second 4K UHD H.264. Caching is struggling here. There's no avoiding it. And bear in mind that these are the file types whereupon things start to become pretty troublesome for a CPU that doesn't have embedded graphics, sure. But also I would hasten to add that file types at this level will be ginormous files. Just to put that into perspective, if we open up the file manager, that file is at a mere, let's have a look for it there, H.264 at there, it's half a gig almost, 431 megabytes for 30 seconds of footage. That means every 2 minutes is going to be almost 800, it's going to be over 860 meg in size. So every 2.5 minutes is give or take a gigabyte. That is going to be ginormous. So don't think these are the sort of file types you're going to see, and the system clearly didn't like it. So let's try the 200 megabits per second 4K UHD H.264 file, and caching here has started, but we can certainly see that caching is not going to do a vast amount of good versus playback right now. It is stuttering at 5, and if we remove the file manager here, we can see that the CPU has given up the ghost. It's just not possible for this processor here. We could try to go in for a conversion before it kicks us out entirely for an automatic conversion, and we'll see if the CPU is prepared to give that a try. It gave it a damn fine go with the memory, and the CPU is at least trying it this time, seeing as we have that spike there appearing, but caching has not resumed. I don't think we're going to get lucky, guys. Oh no, I take it back. It has given us a little surprise there. The CPU is at 100% utilization right now, so it's given everything it can. So even if it does play, no, it wasn't able to do it. So now let's flick over to the H.265 or HEVC and 10-bit versions, and let's kickstart at a 10-bit H.265 file for playback here. I know it sounds remarkably repetitious, but I will always hasten to highlight that these are the file types that are exceptionally high-end. There's very little mainstream media available in these capacities, and these are demonstrations shown to you more for future-proofing than current utilization. If we have a look there, caching has outpaced that of playback. So that's absolutely fine there. We're going to move away from looking at transcoding here because we know we're looking at file types that are already pushing things to their the very limits. Now we're going to move from 30 to 100. So again, this is a 100 megabits per second HEVC file. We're going to go ahead and play that then again, straight into the conversion. And we're going to see those spikes of utilization. Let's see how much higher it was than the 30 meg. And again, we're reaching right there to the top. Practically 100% CPU utilization here. But it is playing back that file, which is great to see. And although buffering isn't quite as good as we might like with the conversion happening there, playback may inevitably overtake that of the background caching and creation of that file. But I think that is where we are peaking right now on native playback. I think that is the height, the 100 megabits per second HD H.265 file. And the minute we move into 4K now with the UHD HEVC 10-bit 120 megabits per second 4K file, we can play that. And again, we can see there, still screen recording there. We can even open up my task manager here, and you'll see that right now CPU utilization isn't too crazy. If anything, Chrome, due to the attempts that we're making in the background, is still not too killer. The system is buffering there. All of the work is being done by the NAS here, not by my internal systems, as you can see from the PC. And now caching has reached a significant point. Playback has begun. But I do think playback is going to win this race. I don't think this system is going to be able to handle that file. And I think that is where we can call it, there we go, at the maximum. Yes, it'll allow it to buffer, but that's going to be no good to us on playback. So that was the 120 megabit file, which again, if we have a look at the 120, that is when we are reaching closer to that half gig that we saw earlier. But of course, we want to run the tests on the big guns. So now we're going to look at the 200 and the 400 before we call it a day. So again, this is H.265 or HEVC 10-bit 4K UHD 200 megabits per second playback. And fair play, it is bloody well trying. Look at it. We are reaching, the caching has started. The CPU is again smashing at the top there with the conversion happening at the background. We can go for an automatic conversion, but the automatic conversion isn't going to give us much different. The automatic and maximum automated transcode at this tier is near enough identical. And the CPU is still trying, but I think this is where we may have to call it a day briefly. But caching there, just scratching along. Even memory utilization in these last barrage of tests has spiked quite dramatically. It will play it, but as you see, even then it didn't play it in the end. The playback just can't be outpaced by the caching and the creation. We're going to let that CPU sit for a second before we go into the last file and call it a day. But I'm going to say this NAS has done extraordinarily well for the hardware architecture, not only because of the ZFS file system in the background and the extra memory maybe being a bonus, but I would argue maybe not significantly enough to count. But I'm more impressed by this non-GPU enabled CPU, no embedded graphics, doing as well as it has done. And once again, I will constantly reiterate that these files here are just dramatically large. At a 30-second file at 1.4 gigabyte, bearing in mind that some of the earliest tests we did were 10 meg, and some of the movies that we tried were between 800 to 1.2 gigabytes. This one 30-second file that we just tried to play was larger than most of those movies, so bear that in mind. But this has been my Plex testing of the brand new QNAP TS-h973AX, their most affordable ZFS powered NAS. If you want to learn more, we are going to be doing more tests on this device, testing what exactly we get out of it and why it is such a special piece of kit. And of course, do stay tuned. I've alluded to it a few times already, but stay tuned for our tests of the up-and-coming 88 A Xeon embedded graphics CPU is a brand new NAS from QNAP that I think may be a real Plex game changer out there. But stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching. Click like if you've enjoyed the video and subscribe to learn more. And visit the links in the description to learn more about NAS in general, this NAS specifically, and of course the guys at span.com, the NAS experts, that will help you every step of the way to get the right solution for you and your Plex media server setup. I will see you next time.